The rain had been falling over Blackwood Hall for 3 days. By the fourth morning, the gardens had disappeared beneath a gray curtain of mist. The stone walls were dark with water, and the ancient oaks surrounding the estate stood like silent witnesses to a family fortune that was slowly dying. Inside the great hall, the last fire of autumn burned weakly beneath a marble mantel. Lord Julian Ashcombe, the 7th Duke of Blackwood, stood before the estate ledger with both hands resting against the heavy oak desk. He had not slept. The numbers had been the same every night for nearly 3 weeks, and every night they became worse. His family had owned Blackwood Hall for more than 200 years. The land stretched across thousands of acres. The house contained portraits of ancestors who had worn the Blackwood title with pride, and generations of servants still moved through its corridors as though nothing had changed. But beneath the polished silver, expensive paintings, and ancient traditions, there was almost nothing left. 3 years of poor harvests had drained the estate. A failed investment had taken what remained of his father's fortune, and now the bank wanted payment. Julian turned another page. The debt was impossible, unless he sold part of the estate. He closed his eyes. Selling the northern fields would bring enough money to delay disaster, but it would also mean dismissing dozens of tenants who had worked the land for generations. Selling the west wing would bring more. Selling Blackwood Hall itself would solve everything. But that was the one thing Julian would never do. His father had made him promise on his deathbed. "Blackwood is not yours to sell," the old duke had whispered. "You are only keeping it safe for the next generation." Julian had been 23 then. He had believed promises were easier to keep than they actually were. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in." His steward, Mr. Hargreaves, entered carrying another letter. Julian looked at him. "Another demand?" Hargreaves hesitated. "Yes, Your Grace." Julian took the letter without opening it. "I assume they have discovered another creative way to remind me that I am poor." Hargreaves gave a tired smile. "There may be another solution." Julian's expression hardened. "I have heard every solution. Not this one." Hargreaves placed a second letter on the desk. "This came from London yesterday." Julian glanced at the seal. It belonged to the Marquis of Wexford. He opened it. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. The Marquis was offering a proposal, not a financial one. A marriage. His daughter, Lady Eleanor Vale, was 24, well-educated, wealthy in her own right, and the sole heir to her mother's substantial fortune. If Julian married her, the marriage settlement would provide enough money to clear Blackwood's immediate debts. Julian stared at the letter. Marriage. He almost laughed. After everything he had spent his life avoiding, the solution to his family's ruin was apparently a wedding. He walked toward the window. Outside, rain slid down the glass. He could already imagine the whispers. The Duke of Blackwood married for money. The proud old family had fallen. The great estate survived only because a wealthy woman purchased its future. He hated the thought. But then he remembered the tenant families, the stable boys, the elderly housekeeper who had served his mother for 40 years, the children of the village school. All of them would suffer if Blackwood collapsed. Julian folded the letter. "Send word to the Marquis." Hargreaves waited. "What shall I tell him?" Julian's jaw tightened. "That I will consider the proposal." 3 days later, Julian met Lady Eleanor Vale for the first time. It was not in a ballroom. There were no musicians, no crowded drawing room, no line of elegant young women waiting to impress a duke. Instead, he found her in the library at Wexford House. She was standing beside a tall window with a book open in her hands. She wore a simple pale blue morning gown. There was nothing extravagant about her, no diamonds, no dramatic hairstyle, no attempt to appear impressive. When Julian entered, she looked up. Their eyes met. For one brief moment, neither spoke. Then she closed the book. "Your Grace," she curtsied. Julian bowed. "Lady Eleanor." She studied him with a calmness that immediately unsettled him. He had expected nervousness. Most women were nervous around him. She wasn't. "Would you like tea?" she asked. Julian almost smiled. "I have come to discuss a marriage." "So have I." Her answer was so direct that he paused. "You knew I was coming? My father told me." And he explained the circumstances. He explained enough. Julian walked toward the fireplace. I would rather be honest with you. I would prefer that. My estate is in financial difficulty. I know. My family has debts. I know. And your father believes your fortune could solve them. Eleanor remained silent. Julian looked at her. I will not pretend otherwise. For the first time, something changed in her expression. Not anger. Something closer to respect. You are not going to tell me that you suddenly fell in love with me. No. She nodded. Good. Julian frowned. Good. I would have found that insulting. That surprised him. Why? Because you have never met me. Julian stared at her. Eleanor closed the book completely. I know what this is, Your Grace. Your family needs money. My father wants a prestigious marriage for me. You need a wife. I need a husband. It is a practical arrangement. She spoke without bitterness. That somehow made it worse. Julian had expected tears. He had expected demands. He had expected a woman desperate to become a duchess. Instead, Eleanor was looking at him as though she were negotiating a business agreement. What would you require? He asked. A separate room. Of course. Freedom to manage my own household affairs. Agreed. I will not be expected to perform affection for society. Julian looked at her for a moment. Agreed. And if you ever fall in love with someone else, I expect honesty. The room became very quiet. Julian hadn't expected that. You are assuming I might. I am assuming you are a man, Your Grace. Something about the way she said it almost made him smile. And what about you? What about me? If you fall in love with someone else? Eleanor looked down at the book in her hands. I don't know. Julian noticed the slight sadness in her voice. It was the first crack in her composure. He wondered who had put it there. He did not ask. Instead, he said quietly, Then we have an agreement. Eleanor held out her hand. Julian looked at it. A strange sensation moved through him. This was not how a man was supposed to meet the woman he might marry. There should have been music, anticipation, romance. Instead, there was rain outside, an old library, and two strangers agreeing to save a dying estate. He took her hand. Her fingers were warm. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Eleanor withdrew her hand. When would you like the wedding? Julian looked at her. As soon as possible. She nodded. Then we should begin. The wedding took place 6 weeks later. It was beautiful, and completely without love. The church was decorated with white roses. The village gathered outside. The bells rang across the valley. Inside, Julian stood at the altar in black formal dress, watching the doors. When Eleanor appeared, the church became silent. She walked toward him slowly. Her wedding gown was elegant rather than extravagant. Pearls rested at her throat. A thin veil framed her face. Julian had seen hundreds of beautiful women, but he had never seen anyone look so calm while walking toward a future neither of them could predict. When she reached him, she looked directly into his eyes. For the first time that day, Julian wondered whether he had made a mistake. Not because he was marrying her, because he suddenly realized he knew almost nothing about her. The ceremony began. Their hands were joined. Their vows were spoken. And when the priest finally declared them husband and wife, Julian turned toward her. He expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar, responsibility. Eleanor was no longer simply Lady Eleanor Vale. She was his wife, and somehow that fact felt heavier than the debt waiting for him at Blackwood. Outside the church, the bells continued ringing. The crowd cheered. Eleanor smiled politely. Julian offered her his arm. She accepted. As they walked toward the waiting carriage, she leaned slightly closer and whispered, Your Grace? Yes? Do not look so frightened. He glanced at her. I am not frightened. She smiled. You are. For the first time since they had met, Julian laughed. It was brief, quiet, but genuine. Eleanor looked at him with surprise, and Julian realized something even more surprising. He wanted to hear her laugh too. Their journey to Blackwood Hall took nearly 4 hours. For most of it, they said very little. Eleanor looked through the carriage window at the countryside. Julian watched her reflection. You can ask, she said. What? You have been staring at me for 10 minutes. Julian looked away. I was wondering whether you regret it. The marriage. Yes. Eleanor thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because I knew exactly what I agreed to. Julian looked at her again. And you, she smiled faintly. I am wondering whether you regret it. I don't. Good. Silence returned. Then Eleanor said, Tell me about Blackwood. Julian was surprised. What would you like to know? Everything. So he began. He told her about the old oak tree behind the chapel, the lake where he had learned to swim, the east meadow where his mother used to ride, the library his grandfather had built, the village school his grandmother had funded, the servants who had worked for the family for generations. As he spoke, his voice changed. The cold duke disappeared. For the first time, Eleanor heard the man beneath the title, and she listened, not because she had to, because she wanted to. When the carriage finally stopped before Blackwood Hall, Eleanor looked through the window. The house rose from the mist like something from another century. Ancient stone, tall windows, ivy climbing the walls, a long driveway disappearing between enormous trees. It is beautiful, she whispered. Julian looked at the estate. It is dying. Eleanor turned toward him. Then perhaps it needs someone willing to fight for it. He looked at her. She smiled softly. After all, that is why you married me. Julian didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't entirely certain that was still the only reason. Blackwood Hall was colder than Eleanor had expected, not because the autumn wind found its way through the old windows, though it certainly did. It was cold because the house seemed to have forgotten how to be lived in. The grand entrance was beautiful, but strangely silent. Portraits of generations of Blackwoods watched from the walls. The furniture was polished to perfection, yet everything felt untouched. Eleanor stepped from the carriage and looked up at the enormous house. Julian stood beside her. Welcome to Blackwood, he said. She glanced at him. Is it always this quiet? Usually. Do you like it? Julian considered the question. I've never thought about it. Eleanor smiled faintly. That may be part of the problem. He looked at her. What problem? The house feels as though everyone is afraid to disturb it. Before Julian could answer, the front doors opened. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, stepped forward with several servants behind her. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Your Grace. Julian nodded. Mrs. Whitmore. Then the housekeeper turned toward Eleanor. My lady. Eleanor smiled. Please, call me Eleanor. The woman looked startled. Then she smiled. I shall try. Julian watched the exchange. His wife had been in the house less than a minute, yet somehow she had already made someone smile. That should not have mattered to him, but it did. The first weeks of their marriage were strangely peaceful. Julian kept his promise. Eleanor had her own rooms. She was given complete control over the household, and neither of them demanded affection from the other. In public, they appeared perfectly married. In private, they were almost strangers. Every morning, Julian left early to inspect the estate. Every afternoon, Eleanor found something new that needed attention. The kitchen roof needed repairs. The nursery had been closed for years. Several servants had not received proper wages in months. The village school needed books. The estate accounts were a disaster. Eleanor began working. She did not ask Julian for permission. She simply began. One morning, Julian entered the breakfast room and found 3 stacks of papers beside his plate. He stopped. What is this? Eleanor continued drinking her tea. Your estate. Julian looked at the papers. I have an estate. You have debts. He looked at her. I am aware. And your tenants are paying higher rents than they can afford. His expression changed. Who told you that? No one. Then how do you know? I read the accounts. You read the estate accounts. I can read. He stared at her. That was not what I meant. I know. A tiny smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Julian sat down. What have you found? Eleanor pushed one of the papers toward him. The northern tenants are behind on payments. I know. You are planning to collect the arrears before winter. I have no choice. You do. He looked at her. If you reduce their rent temporarily, they can recover after the next harvest. And how exactly does that help me? It doesn't. Julian raised an eyebrow. Eleanor met his gaze. It helps them. He was silent. You cannot save Blackwood by destroying the people who keep it alive. she continued. Julian leaned back. You have been here for 12 days, and you are already telling me how to run my estate. No. She took another sip of tea. I am telling you how I think it should be run. Julian almost laughed. You are very confident. I had to become confident. There was something in her voice that made him pause. He wanted to ask why, but she had already returned to the papers. That afternoon, Julian rode to the northern fields. He expected to find Eleanor's concerns exaggerated. Instead, he found exactly what she had described. A tenant named Mr. Miller stood outside his cottage with his wife and 2 young children. When he saw Julian, he removed his hat. Your Grace. Julian looked around. The roof needed repair. The children's clothes were thin. The field beyond them was poor. He remembered Eleanor's words. You cannot save Blackwood by destroying the people who keep it alive. He stayed longer than he intended. When he returned to the house that evening, Eleanor was in the library. She looked up from her book. How was your ride? Julian removed his gloves. You were right, she blinked. About the northern tenants. Yes, a small smile appeared. Thank you. Julian walked toward the fireplace. I have ordered the rents reduced until spring. Eleanor closed her book. That was generous. It was practical. Of course. He looked at her. Don't what? Look at me as though I have done something noble. I wasn't. You were, she smiled. Perhaps a little. For some reason, Julian smiled too. As the weeks passed, something changed between them. It was subtle. So subtle that neither could identify the exact moment it began. Julian began coming to breakfast later, not because he enjoyed breakfast, because Eleanor was there. Eleanor began taking tea in the library, not because she needed the books, because Julian often worked there in the evenings. They spoke. At first about the estate, then about books, then music, then childhood. One evening, Eleanor found Julian staring at an old portrait. It showed a young woman in a pale green dress. Your mother? She asked. Yes, she was beautiful. She was. Julian's voice became quiet. She hated this portrait. Why? She said the artist made her look too serious. Eleanor studied the painting. She looks lonely. Julian turned toward her. She was. Eleanor looked at him. I'm sorry. He gave a small shrug. She married my father because their families expected it. Eleanor's expression changed. Julian noticed. Why are you looking at me like that? Because you understand what that feels like. He was silent. Then he said, yes. For the first time, the silence between them did not feel uncomfortable. It felt intimate. One evening, Eleanor was walking through the west corridor when she heard music. She followed the sound. Julian was playing the piano. She stopped in the doorway. He didn't notice her. His face looked completely different when he played. There was no Duke, no cold expression, no responsibility, just a man sitting alone at a piano. When the piece ended, Eleanor quietly applauded. Julian turned. You startled me. I apologize. You were listening? I was. He looked embarrassed. I didn't know you played. There are many things you don't know about me. Eleanor smiled. I suppose there are. He stood. Do you play? A little. Show me. She hesitated. Then she walked toward the piano. Julian stepped aside. Their shoulders almost touched. Eleanor sat. She played a simple melody. Julian listened. When she finished, he said, that was beautiful. You don't have to be polite. I wasn't. She looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, neither moved. Julian became aware of how close she was. A strand of hair had fallen near her cheek. Without thinking, he reached toward it, then stopped. His hand remained suspended between them. Eleanor looked at his hand, then at him. Julian lowered it. I apologize. She shook her head. You don't have to. But neither of them spoke again. The first ball after their wedding was held at Ashford House. Eleanor had been nervous about attending. She knew what society would say. She was not a duke's daughter. She had not been raised to become a duchess. And she knew many women believed she had purchased the title through her family's fortune. When she entered the ballroom beside Julian, the conversations became quieter. Julian noticed. His expression hardened. Eleanor touched his arm. Don't. Don't what? Fight everyone. I wasn't planning to. You were. He looked at her. I dislike the way they are looking at you. Eleanor smiled faintly. I can survive being looked at. Julian leaned closer. I know. His voice was low. That isn't what concerns me. Before she could answer, the orchestra began playing. A gentleman approached. Lady Blackwood, may I have this dance? Eleanor glanced at Julian. He said nothing. She accepted. Julian watched her walk away. He told himself he was only being protective. But when another gentleman approached Eleanor during the second dance, Julian's expression became colder. When a third gentleman laughed at something she said, Julian looked away. He did not understand why, until Lady Caroline Rexford appeared beside him. You look unhappy, Your Grace. I am not. Caroline smiled. Your wife seems to be enjoying herself. Julian watched Eleanor. She is. Perhaps you should dance with her. Julian looked at Caroline. Perhaps I should. He crossed the ballroom. Eleanor saw him approaching. Your Grace? He bowed. May I have this dance? She looked surprised. I thought you disliked dancing. I do. Then why ask? His eyes remained on hers. Because I dislike watching other men dance with my wife even more. Eleanor's cheeks warmed. You sound jealous. I am. The honesty of the answer caught her completely off guard. The music began. Julian took her hand. His other hand settled carefully at her waist. For the first few moments, neither spoke. They moved across the floor. Eleanor looked up at him. You are staring. I know. Why? Julian hesitated. Then he said quietly, because every time I look away, someone else is looking at you. Her heart skipped. Perhaps you should look away less often. Julian smiled. It was the first time Eleanor had seen him smile during a dance, and suddenly the crowded ballroom seemed very far away. Later that evening, they stepped onto the terrace. The night air was cold. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. Julian noticed. Without a word, he removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. You'll be cold. I'll survive. You always say that. She looked at him. What? You always say you can survive everything. Eleanor smiled sadly. Perhaps because I had to. Julian's expression softened. He wanted to ask what she meant. Instead, he said, you don't have to survive everything alone anymore. Eleanor looked at him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she whispered, neither do you. Julian felt something tighten in his chest. He had married Eleanor Vale to save his family's estate. That was the reason. That was supposed to be enough. But as he stood beside her beneath the moonlit sky, he began to fear that the bargain they had made was becoming something neither of them had planned. And for the first time, Julian wondered what would happen if the estate were saved. But the woman standing beside him decided she no longer wanted to stay. The night after the ball, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She stood beside the tall window of her bedroom, looking across the dark gardens. Julian's words kept returning to her. Because every time I look away, someone else is looking at you. It had been a simple sentence, yet she had thought about it for hours. She had married Julian knowing exactly what their arrangement was. He needed her fortune. She needed a husband. That was all. At least, that was what she had told herself. But lately, things had become more complicated. She had begun waiting for his footsteps in the corridor. She noticed when he skipped breakfast. She knew when something was troubling him simply by the way he held his shoulders, and now she knew the warmth of his hand at her waist. Eleanor touched her cheek and immediately shook her head. This is foolish. She stepped away from the window. She would not fall in love with a man who had married her for money. She would not. The next morning, Julian was already in the stables when Eleanor arrived. She had decided to ride before breakfast. He looked up when he saw her. You're awake early. So are you. I always am. Then perhaps I should stop pretending I am an early riser. A faint smile appeared on his face. Perhaps. Eleanor approached the horses. I thought I would ride to the southern meadow. I'll come with you. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know. That answer made her smile. They rode together. At first, there was only the sound of hooves against the damp earth. Then Eleanor noticed Julian looking toward the horizon. What are you thinking? The estate. You always think about the estate. It is my responsibility. And what about yourself? He looked at her. I am not sure I remember how. Eleanor slowed her horse. Julian stopped beside her. You should learn, she said. Why? Because one day you may discover that you have spent your entire life protecting things you never stopped to enjoy. He stared at her. Then he smiled. Is that advice from my Duchess? No. Then who? Your wife. Something about the distinction touched him. He nodded. Then I will consider it. They reached the southern meadow near noon. Eleanor dismounted. A strong wind moved through the tall grass. Julian tied the horses and joined her. She walked toward an old stone wall. Did you come here often as a child? Yes. What did you do? Nothing. She laughed. Nothing. I would sit here and read. You were a lonely child. Julian looked at her. You are very observant. I've noticed. He looked toward the distant hills. My father was always away. My mother was often ill. I learned early that the estate needed someone. And you became that person. Yes. Eleanor turned toward him. You never had the chance to simply be Julian. He looked at her. Perhaps not. She smiled. You can now. He studied her face. Can I? Yes. How? She thought for a moment. Start by telling me something you have never told anyone. Julian was silent. Then he said, When I was 16, I wanted to leave England. Eleanor blinked. Why didn't you? My father told me I would never be allowed to abandon my responsibilities. And did you want to? More than anything. Where would you have gone? Anywhere. She smiled. I would have gone to Italy. Why Italy? I've always wanted to see Venice. Julian looked at her. Then perhaps we should go. She laughed softly. Perhaps one day. Neither of them noticed how naturally the word we had entered their conversation. That afternoon, Julian returned to the house and found Eleanor in the garden. She was kneeling beside a rose bush. Her gloves were covered with soil. He stopped. You're a duchess. She looked up. I am aware. Duchesses don't usually garden. Then perhaps they should. He walked closer. What are you doing? Saving these. She held up a damaged rose. Julian smiled. From what? Neglect. He looked at the garden. Half the flowers were dead. The rest had been left untouched for years. Eleanor had already transformed one corner. I thought you were going to save the estate. I am. By planting roses. By starting somewhere. He crouched beside her. What do you need? She looked surprised. Help. Julian rolled up his sleeves. For the next hour, the Duke of Blackwood worked in the garden beside his wife. Neither noticed the servants watching through the windows. Mrs. Whitmore smiled. It is about time, she whispered. The days began changing. Julian no longer ate alone. Eleanor no longer spent every evening in the library by herself. They began walking together. They began discussing estate plans over breakfast. They began laughing, and sometimes they simply sat together without speaking. One evening, Eleanor was reading near the fireplace when Julian entered. He carried a book. She looked up. What is that? The book you mentioned. She stared at it. You found it? I ordered it from London. She took it from him. You remembered, of course. Her fingers brushed his. Julian didn't pull away immediately. Neither did she. Their eyes met. Then Eleanor quietly said, Thank you. You're welcome. He sat across from her. She opened the book. After a few minutes, she noticed he was still looking at her. What? Nothing. You are staring again. I know. She smiled. You do that often. I am beginning to think I have a reason. Her heart beat faster. Before she could answer, the door opened. Mrs. Whitmore entered. Your Grace, Lady Blackwood, dinner is ready. Julian stood. He offered Eleanor his hand. She accepted. Neither of them mentioned what had almost been said. A week later, the first serious disagreement between them came. Eleanor discovered that Julian had decided to sell a portion of the southern land. She confronted him in his study. You said we would find another way. I said I would try. This land belongs to the estate. So does everything else. You promised the tenants would not be forced out. They won't be. You are selling the land to a neighboring lord. Yes. Why? Because we need the money. Eleanor stared at him. You could have discussed this with me. Julian's expression hardened. It is my estate. The words fell between them. Eleanor became very still. Yes. Julian immediately realized what he had said, but pride prevented him from taking it back. Eleanor placed the papers on his desk. I understand. She turned. Eleanor. She stopped. He wanted to apologize. Instead, he said, I had no intention of hurting you. She looked back. You didn't hurt me, Your Grace. Her voice was calm. You simply reminded me of what I am. Then she left. Julian stood alone. For the first time since their marriage, the house felt cold again. That evening, Eleanor did not come to dinner. Julian waited. She did not appear. He waited another hour. Still nothing. Finally, he went to her rooms. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Eleanor. Silence. He opened the door. She was sitting beside the window. You shouldn't be here, she said. I know. He remained near the doorway. I was wrong. She looked at him. He walked closer. I should have spoken to you. Yes. And I should not have said it was my estate. No. He stopped in front of her. I am sorry. Eleanor looked at him for several seconds. Then she smiled faintly. Thank you. He sat beside her. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Eleanor whispered, You are afraid. Julian looked at her. Of what? That if you let someone help you, you will lose control. He looked away. She continued, You've spent your entire life believing that everything depends on you. It does. No. She gently shook her head. It depends on people. Julian looked back at her. People leave. So do estates. He frowned. She smiled sadly. You cannot protect yourself from losing everything by refusing to love anything. The words struck deeper than she intended. Julian looked at her. Do you think I am afraid of loving? I think you are afraid of needing. He was silent. Then, very quietly, Perhaps I am. The next morning, Julian changed the order. The southern land would not be sold. Instead, he would refinance the debt and accept a smaller temporary loss. It was more difficult. It would take longer, but the tenants would remain. When Eleanor learned what he had done, she found him in the courtyard. You changed the plan. Yes. Why? Julian looked at her. Because you were right. She smiled. You say that surprisingly often. Don't become accustomed to it. She laughed. He smiled. Then, without thinking, he reached for her hand. She looked down. Their fingers intertwined. Neither of them spoke. It was the simplest gesture, but it felt different from every touch before it. Julian looked at their joined hands, then at her. I don't know when this happened. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Neither do I. He lifted her hand and kissed her fingers, not as a duke, not as a husband fulfilling an obligation, but as a man who was beginning to realize that the woman he had married for practical reasons had become something far more dangerous to his heart, something he could not simply dismiss. That night, a letter arrived from London. Julian opened it alone. His expression changed as he read. The bank had rejected the new arrangement. Blackwood had one final chance. The entire remaining debt would have to be paid within 2 months. Otherwise, the estate would be seized. Julian lowered the letter. For the first time in weeks, he felt genuine fear. Not for himself, not even for the estate, for Eleanor. Because if Blackwood fell, the marriage settlement would be examined. Society would say she had failed to save the family. Her reputation would be destroyed. And Julian suddenly understood something that frightened him more than the debt itself. He could survive losing Blackwood. He could survive losing his title. But the thought of losing Eleanor was becoming unbearable. He folded the letter and placed it inside the drawer. He would solve it. He had to. Because somewhere between the wedding and this moment, the bargain had changed. He had married Eleanor to save his family. Now he was beginning to realize that he would give up almost anything to save her. The letter remained hidden in Julian's desk for 2 days. He told himself he was protecting Eleanor from unnecessary worry. In truth, he was protecting himself from the look he knew he would see in her eyes if she learned how serious the situation had become. Blackwood had 2 months. 2 months to find enough money to prevent the estate from being seized. Julian had already sold everything he could sell without destroying the estate. There was nothing left, except one possibility. A wealthy investor in London had offered to purchase the southern forests. The price was enough to save Blackwood, but accepting it would mean giving up the land Julian had promised never to sell. He had spent 2 nights trying to find another answer. There wasn't one. And so, on the 3rd morning, he left for London. He did not tell Eleanor. Eleanor noticed his absence immediately. "Where is His Grace?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "He left early." "Did he say where he was going?" "London." Eleanor frowned. "When will he return?" "I don't know, my lady." Something about the answer unsettled her. Julian had never left without telling her before. Not anymore. They had become too accustomed to one another. She knew his habits. He knew hers. His sudden silence felt like a door closing. That afternoon, Eleanor entered his study. She did not intend to search his desk. She only wanted to find the estate records. But as she reached for the ledger, a folded document slipped from beneath it. She picked it up. The seal had already been broken. Her eyes moved across the page. Her face slowly lost its color. Final payment required within 60 days. Blackwood would be seized. She read it twice. Then again. Julian had known. He had known for days, and he had said nothing. Eleanor lowered the letter. She suddenly understood his distance, his long nights, his silence, the way he had looked at her that morning before leaving. He had been carrying all of it alone. Again, Julian returned 2 days later. It was nearly midnight. The house was silent. He entered the library expecting to find it empty. Instead, Eleanor was waiting beside the fireplace. The letter lay on the table between them. Julian stopped. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Eleanor said, "How long?" He looked at the letter. 3 days. "And you intended to tell me when?" "When I had solved it." She shook her head. "You mean when you had decided what you were going to sacrifice without asking me?" Julian's expression tightened. "I can handle this." "That is not the point. It is my responsibility." "No." Her voice trembled. "It is our home." Julian looked at her. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." He walked toward the fireplace. "If Blackwood is seized, the tenants lose their homes. The servants lose their positions. My family name becomes worthless. And what happens to me?" He looked at her. "You will be fine." The words were meant to comfort her. Instead, they hurt. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Fine?" Julian immediately realized his mistake. "I didn't mean, you married me because my fortune could save this estate. That was the agreement." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "And now that you may lose everything, you think you can simply send me away?" "No." "Then what do you intend to do?" Julian said nothing. Eleanor stepped closer. "You have already decided to sacrifice yourself." His silence answered her. She looked at him with disbelief. "You would rather lose everything than ask me for help." "I will not take more from you. You took my life when you married me." He flinched. "And somehow," she continued, "you still think you are the only person who has something to lose." Julian stared at her. "I cannot watch you sacrifice your family's future. And I cannot watch you destroy yourself trying to save mine." Silence filled the room. Eleanor turned away. Perhaps this marriage was never meant to become anything more than an agreement. Julian's heart dropped. "Eleanor." She stopped. He crossed the room. "Don't say that." She looked back at him. "Why?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came. Because the truth was standing directly in front of him, and he was terrified to say it. The next morning, Eleanor received a letter from her father. The Marquis of Wexford had heard about Blackwood's financial troubles. He offered her an escape. If she returned to Wexford House, the marriage could be quietly dissolved. Her father would provide her with a separate residence. Her reputation could be protected. She would no longer be tied to a failing estate. Eleanor read the letter alone. It was reasonable, practical, exactly what she should want. Yet her heart felt strangely empty. She folded the letter. She did not know what frightened her more, staying with Julian or leaving him. That afternoon, Eleanor walked through the gardens. She stopped beside the old rose bush she had repaired. Several new flowers had opened. She touched one gently. Behind her she heard footsteps, Julian. He stopped a few feet away. You've been avoiding me. She turned. You've been avoiding me too. I was afraid. The admission surprised her. Of what? Losing you. Eleanor's breath caught. Julian took a step closer. I thought I was afraid of losing Blackwood. He gave a bitter smile. I was wrong. She stared at him. I can lose the estate. His voice became quieter. I can lose the title. I can sell the house. I can begin again somewhere else. He looked directly at her. But I cannot imagine returning to a life without you. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Julian. It was the first time she had said his name without his title. He closed his eyes for a moment. Hearing his name from her sounded more intimate than any declaration. When he opened his eyes, she was still looking at him. I don't want your fortune, he said. You already have it. No. He shook his head. I mean, I don't want your money. Then what do you want? He stepped closer. You. The garden became completely silent. Eleanor looked down. You cannot say that because you are frightened. I know. You cannot say it because you think I am leaving. I know. Then why? Julian's voice broke slightly. Because it is true. For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe him. But before she could answer, a horse appeared on the driveway. A messenger dismounted. Your Grace. Julian turned. What is it? The man handed him a sealed letter. Julian opened it. His expression changed. Eleanor immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? The bank has accepted the investor's offer. She stared at him. You sold the Southern Forest. Julian said nothing. You told me you wouldn't. I had no choice. You did. He looked at her. I chose Blackwood. No. Her voice became quiet. You chose the estate. Julian stepped toward her. Eleanor. She shook her head. You promised me you would never make another decision like this without me. I was trying to protect you. From what? From losing everything. She looked at him through tears. And now you've lost my trust. Julian froze. She walked away. This time he did not follow. That night, Eleanor packed. Not because she wanted to leave, because she no longer knew how to stay. She placed her clothes into a traveling case, then stopped. Her eyes fell on the book Julian had brought her. She picked it up. Inside the cover was a small handwritten note. For the woman who taught me that a home is more than stone and land. Eleanor closed her eyes. A tear fell onto the page. She sat on the edge of the bed. She loved him. The realization came without warning. There was no argument against it, no practical explanation, no way to pretend otherwise. She loved him, and that was exactly why she had to leave. Because loving Julian meant watching him sacrifice everything he had for an estate that had already taken too much from him. At dawn, Eleanor left Blackwood Hall. She did not wake Julian. She left a letter on his desk. Your Grace, when I came to Blackwood, I believed I was entering a marriage without love. Somewhere along the way, that changed. I have come to care for you more than I should, but I cannot remain and watch you destroy yourself for me. Perhaps one day you will understand that saving a home does not mean keeping every stone of it. Sometimes it means knowing when to let it go. Eleanor. Julian found the letter an hour later. He read it once. Then again, he sat down. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Blackwood had no plan, no strategy, no solution, only the terrible knowledge that the woman he loved had left because she believed she was saving him. He looked around the study, the portraits, the books, the ancient furniture, the estate records. Everything he had spent his life protecting suddenly seemed meaningless. He picked up Eleanor's letter. Then he noticed something. A small rose petal had fallen between the pages, the same pale rose she had planted in the garden. Julian closed his eyes. He finally understood. Blackwood had never been the thing he was trying to save. It was Eleanor, and he had just allowed her to walk away. He rose immediately. Prepare the carriage. The servant looked surprised. Where are we going, Your Grace? Julian grabbed his coat. To Wexford. He stopped at the door, then added, and if anyone asks why the Duke of Blackwood is riding across the country without a proper escort, he looked toward the empty corridor. Tell them I finally discovered something more important than being a duke. The carriage raced through the countryside. Julian had never traveled so quickly in his life. The wheels struck the muddy road again and again, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was Eleanor, her voice, her smile, the way she had looked at him in the garden, and finally, the words she had left behind. "I have come to care for you more than I should." Julian closed his eyes. He had spent his entire life believing that strength meant carrying everything alone. His father's expectations, the family name, the estate, the debts, the servants, the tenants. He had believed that asking for help was weakness. But Eleanor had shown him the truth. Sometimes refusing help was simply another form of pride. And his pride had nearly cost him the woman he loved. Wexford House appeared just before sunset. Julian stepped from the carriage before it had completely stopped. The butler opened the doors. "Your Grace, I need to see Lady Eleanor." The butler hesitated. "Lady Eleanor is, please." There was something in Julian's voice that made the man immediately step aside. "She is in the West Garden." Julian walked quickly through the house. He found Eleanor beneath an old oak tree. She was sitting alone on a stone bench. When she heard footsteps, she looked up. Her expression changed when she saw him. "Julian." He stopped. For a moment neither moved. Then Eleanor stood. "You shouldn't have come." "I know. Why are you here?" He took a breath. "Because I was wrong." She looked away. "You already apologized." "I wasn't talking about the forest." She looked back. "I was wrong about everything." He stepped closer. "I thought being a duke meant I had to protect everyone. I thought if I carried every burden alone, no one else would have to suffer." His voice softened. "But I never understood that by shutting you out, I was making you suffer anyway." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you." Julian's heart tightened. "I know. I left because I thought you would never choose me over Blackwood." He shook his head. "I have already chosen." She stared at him. "The estate is sold." Her eyes widened. "You sold it?" "No." He smiled faintly. "I canceled the sale. But the debt, I have another plan." "What plan?" "I will sell the London townhouse, some of the paintings, the racing horses, and I will renegotiate the remaining debt." "That won't save everything." "No." He stepped closer. "It won't." "Then what will?" Julian looked directly into her eyes. "Perhaps Blackwood doesn't need to remain exactly as it was." Eleanor said nothing. "I spent my whole life protecting a house because I thought that was what my father wanted." He looked toward the distant horizon. "But perhaps he wanted me to protect the people who called it home." Eleanor's lips trembled. "And if that means losing the title?" "I'll survive." "The estate?" "I'll survive." "Your fortune?" "I'll survive," she whispered. "And me." Julian looked at her. "That is the one thing I cannot lose." Eleanor began to cry. Julian took one slow step toward her. "I married you because I needed your family's money." She closed her eyes. "I know. I was selfish. Yes. I was afraid. Yes. I thought I could keep our marriage separate from my heart." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I failed." She laughed through her tears. "That doesn't sound like much of a failure." Julian smiled. "No." He reached for her hand. This time she let him take it. "I love you, Eleanor." She looked at him. "I love you too." For a moment they simply stood there. No grand ballroom, no audience, no title, no bargain. Just two people who had finally stopped pretending they were strangers. Julian lifted her hand and kissed it. Then he gently touched her cheek. "Come home." Eleanor smiled. "Blackwood?" "No." He looked at her with complete honesty. "Home." They returned to Blackwood 3 days later. But the estate was not the same. Neither were they. Julian began making difficult changes. He sold the London townhouse. He reduced the number of unnecessary staff positions without abandoning those who had served the family for years. He sold several valuable paintings. He renegotiated the estate's debts. And most importantly, he stopped pretending that Blackwood had to remain frozen in the past. The West Wing was opened as a school and community hall. The unused stables were converted into workshops. The old greenhouse was restored. The tenants were given more reasonable contracts, and Eleanor became deeply involved in the running of the estate. She did not save Blackwood with her fortune. She helped save it with her ideas. Julian finally understood the difference. Months passed. Winter arrived. Snow covered the gardens. One morning, Eleanor woke to find a small box beside her breakfast plate. She looked at Julian. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was a delicate silver necklace. At its center was a tiny rose. Eleanor touched it. "It is beautiful. I found it in London." She looked at him. "Why a rose?" "Because you planted the first one." She smiled. "You remember everything." "Not everything." "What do you forget?" He leaned closer. "Everything else when you are near me." She laughed. "That was terrible." "I know, but I liked it." He smiled. That evening, a ball was held at Blackwood Hall. For the first time in years, the house was filled with music. The candles reflected in the tall windows. Servants moved through the halls. Guests laughed. Children ran through the garden. And the estate felt alive again. Eleanor stood near the ballroom entrance. Julian approached. "May I have this dance?" She raised an eyebrow. "I thought you disliked dancing." "I still do." "Then why ask?" He held out his hand. "Because I have discovered that there is one woman I don't mind dancing with." She placed her hand in his. "One. Only one." They stepped onto the floor. The orchestra began. Julian looked at her. "Do you remember our first dance?" "Yes. You told me I was jealous." "You were." "I was." She smiled. "You were also staring." "I still am." She laughed. The dance continued. Around them, people watched the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. But Julian barely noticed. He only saw Eleanor, the woman he had married to save an estate, the woman who had taught him that a home was not made from stone, the woman who had shown him that love was not weakness, the woman he had once believed he could lose without consequence, and the only woman he now knew he could never live without. Later that night, Julian and Eleanor walked through the quiet gardens. Snow had begun to fall. Eleanor looked toward the house. "Do you ever miss the old Blackwood?" Julian thought about it. "Yes." She looked at him. "Really?" "Sometimes." Then he smiled. "But I don't miss the man who lived there." "Why?" "Because he didn't know how lucky he was." Eleanor slipped her hand into his. "And now?" Julian looked down at their joined hands. "Now I know." They continued walking. The snow fell softly around them. Behind them, Blackwood Hall glowed warmly against the winter darkness. It was no longer simply an inheritance, no longer merely a title, no longer a burden passed from one generation to another. It was a home, and at its heart stood the woman who had entered Julian's life as part of a bargain, and remained because she had become the one thing he had never expected to find: love. The Duke had married her to save his family's estate, but in the end, she became the only woman he could not lose.